In the sprawling cotton fields that once dominated the American South, particularly in the Black Belt region stretching from South Carolina to Mississippi, a haunting tale of human endurance and suffering unfolded daily beneath the merciless sun. Cotton, often called white gold, generated astronomical wealth. By 1860, the Mississippi Delta alone produced more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the United States. Yet this wealth came at a devastating human cost that many history books fail to fully convey. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky, exhausted workers were already trudging toward the cotton fields. Solomon Northup, who documented his experiences in 12 Years a Slave, described the morning routine. The day begins with the first dim streak of dawn and ends when the darkness sets in. On the notorious woodland plantation in Louisiana, the overseer John Bones was known to fire his pistol at 4 a.m. each morning, a sound that became synonymous with terror for the workers. This brutal schedule wasn't merely long, it was deliberately designed to extract maximum labor while destroying the human spirit. As Frederick Law Olmsted observed during his travels through the South in the 1850s, the slaves are commonly at work by daybreak, and at night the picking goes on until it is too dark to see. The picking itself was an art form born of necessity and suffering. Workers had to develop a precise technique. Using both hands simultaneously, they would pull the cotton from its thorny prison while avoiding the sharp bowl casings that could slice flesh like paper. Their fingers, often wrapped in rudimentary cloth protection, would be bloodied and raw by day's end. Mary Reynolds, a former slave, whose testimony was recorded in the 1930s Federal Writers Project, recalled, "When you're picking cotton, you're battling the plant itself. Every handful is a fight, and your hands tell the story of every battle." On the infamous Butler Plantation in Georgia, workers were expected to pick between 150 and 200 pounds of cotton daily, a quota that often meant choosing between sleep and avoiding brutal punishment. The southern summer heat was perhaps the most merciless overseer of all. In states like Mississippi and Georgia, temperatures regularly soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. The humidity created a suffocating blanket that made every breath a struggle. Workers were expected to maintain their pace regardless of conditions, with heat exhaustion and heat stroke claiming countless lives. In 1845, a plantation owner's diary from Louisiana noted matter-of-factly, "Lost 2 field hands to the heat today. Production must continue." The Forks of Cypress Plantation in Alabama became notorious for forcing workers to wear heavy clothing, even in extreme heat, supposedly to protect the cotton from sweat contamination, a practice that led to numerous deaths documented by local physicians. The desperate need for water was often used as a tool of control. Charles Ball, in his 1837 memoir, Slavery in the United States, described how overseers would sometimes pour the water onto the ground in front of desperate workers, forcing them to watch it soak into the earth. Access to water was strictly regulated, with workers sometimes forced to drink from stagnant ditches or go without. On the Whitehall Plantation in South Carolina, overseer Thomas Thistlewood documented his water discipline system, placing single water barrels at quarter-mile intervals, forcing workers to walk long stretches under the burning sun just to get a drink. This practice not only led to severe dehydration, but also various waterborne illnesses that spread through the workforce. The matter of sustenance was equally grim. The typical daily ration often consisted of a meager portion of cornmeal and perhaps a few ounces of salt pork, barely enough to sustain an adult performing heavy labor. On the Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana, weekly rations consisted of just 5 pounds of cornmeal, 2 pounds of pork, and a pint of molasses, meant to sustain a person performing back-breaking labor for 7 days. Some plantations operated on what they called the least-cost feeding program, providing only enough food to keep workers alive and productive. A physician's report from 1850 noted that the average plantation worker consumed fewer calories than modern prisoners of war were guaranteed under international conventions a century later. Harriet Jacobs, in her narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, wrote, "The best food was set aside for the white family, while the slaves received the merest scraps, and sometimes not even that." The effects of this systematic malnourishment were devastating and far-reaching. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, despite his racist views, documented in his medical journals the widespread occurrence of pellagra and scurvy among plantation workers. Workers suffered from various deficiency diseases, their bodies literally consuming themselves to maintain basic functions. Children born into this system often showed signs of stunted growth and developmental issues. The lack of proper nutrition made workers more susceptible to diseases that swept through the cramped living quarters, where they were forced to rest their broken bodies. The infamous Black House at the Evergreen Plantation in Louisiana housed up to 20 people in a space barely 200 square feet, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. The cotton itself became an instrument of torture. Its fine dust filled workers' lungs, causing chronic respiratory problems that would plague them for life. The plant's sharp edges would leave countless small cuts that, in the humid environment and without proper medical care, frequently became infected. Dr. James Marion Sims, while notorious for his unethical medical experiments, documented the widespread occurrence of cotton consumption, a respiratory disease specific to cotton workers. These infections, combined with the general physical deterioration from overwork and malnutrition, created a perfect storm of suffering. This brutal system was not just about physical labor, it was designed to break the human spirit. Overseers used a calculated combination of exhaustion, hunger, and pain to maintain control. William Wells Brown, an escaped slave turned abolitionist, wrote in 1847, "The cotton field is where souls are broken, where hope goes to die." The few hours of rest allowed were barely enough for bodies to recover before the next day's ordeal began. Frederick Douglass wrote that the system was designed to transform the slave into a thing, to make him like a brute beast. On the Dockery Plantation in Mississippi, overseers maintained what they called the sundown rule. Anyone not meeting their daily quota would work through the night by lantern light, regardless of exhaustion. Throughout the South, the cotton economy created a system where human suffering was converted into wealth, where the abundance of the harvest was inversely proportional to the health of those who gathered it. By 1860, the cotton exports from the American South exceeded $190 million annually, equivalent to billions in today's currency. The same fields that created enormous wealth for some became open-air prisons for others, where the daily struggle for survival played out under the watchful eye of those who viewed human beings as mere instruments of production. This history demands recognition not just as a catalogue of horrors, but as a testament to human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. Every cotton boll picked, every sunrise faced, every day survived was an act of defiance against a system designed to break the human spirit. As Sojourner Truth declared in her famous 1851 speech, "And ain't I a woman? Look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman?" Whipping machines and iron collars, the most sadistic punishments on cotton plantations. The history of cotton plantations harbors a particularly sinister chapter that reveals humanity's capacity for calculated cruelty. Beyond the backbreaking labor and harsh conditions lay a sophisticated system of punishment designed not just to hurt, but to terrorize and dehumanize on an industrial scale. The punishment system, as historian Edward Baptist notes, was not merely about discipline, it was a science of breaking human beings. The whip served as the primary instrument of this terror system, its crack echoing across plantations like thunder. These weren't simple leather straps, but carefully crafted tools of torture, often made with 9 separate lengths of knotted rope or leather, each designed to tear flesh, hence the term cat o' nine tails. Solomon Northup described the sound as the very blood-chilling, noting how it would cut through the air and fall heavily upon the naked flesh, causing the victim to spring forward, oftentimes with a convulsive start. At the notorious Myrtles Plantation in Louisiana, overseer James Ryder kept detailed records of his whipping technique, describing how he would soak the whip in salt water to maximize pain. Former slave Henry Bibb recalled, "The crack of the whip and the shriek of the slave form the music of the South." The brutality wasn't random, but followed a perverse logic. Missed cotton-picking quotas, typically set at impossible levels, would result in methodically counted lashes. William Wells Brown, an escaped enslaved person turned abolitionist, documented how overseers would often require other workers to count the lashes allowed, adding psychological torment to physical pain. At the Smithfield Plantation in Virginia, overseer Thomas Jefferson Green maintained a detailed punishment ledger correlating cotton quotas with lash counts. Each pound under quota resulted in 2 lashes, creating what he called a mathematical certainty of correction. More severe infractions called for more permanent marks of punishment. On the notorious Whitehall Plantation in Georgia, records show that ear cropping was a common practice for those caught planning escape attempts. The plantation's medical ledger from 1842 documented 37 ear croppings in a single month. Branding, using heated metal shapes to permanently mark the skin, wasn't just about punishment, it was about ownership. The infamous R brand, for Runaway, would ensure that an escaped person, if caught, would face even harsher punishment upon return. At the Belmont Plantation in Mississippi, owner James H. Hammond used a distinctive H brand, which archaeologists have found referenced in runaway slave advertisements from as far away as Texas. The implementation of torture devices showed a chilling level of innovation. The iron collar, often fitted with inward-pointing spikes, was designed to prevent sleep and cause constant pain with any head movement. Thomas Thistlewood's diary from his Jamaica plantation detailed the use of these collars, noting how they would be left on for weeks or months at a time, resulting in severe infections and permanent scarring. At the Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana, archaeologists discovered a collection of these devices, including one particularly cruel variant with bells attached, ensuring that the wearer could never move without drawing attention. Hobbling, the deliberate breaking or maiming of legs to prevent escape, was practiced with calculated precision, designed to limit mobility while still allowing fieldwork. Dr. J. Marion Sims, known as the father of modern gynecology, documented these practices in his medical journals, noting how some overseers preferred to sever the Achilles tendon rather than break bones, as it allowed for quicker healing and return to labor. The architecture of punishment extended to specialized torture devices. The whipping machine, first documented at the Wessington Plantation in Tennessee, could deliver a precise number of lashes with mechanical efficiency. Invented by plantation owner Joseph Washington, a distant cousin of the first president in 1840, the device used a system of pulleys and weights to ensure consistent force in each lash. Iron masks, thumb screws, and ankle chains were standard equipment. The inventory list from the Belmont Plantation's punishment shed, dated 1857, reads like a medieval torturer's shopping list, including devices specifically designed to maximize pain while minimizing permanent damage that might reduce a slave's market value. The notorious Andersonville prison would later adopt many of these devices, with Confederate Captain Henry Wirtz specifically citing plantation punishment methods as his inspiration. Public executions served as theatrical demonstrations of power. These weren't swift deaths, but carefully orchestrated spectacles designed to instill maximum terror. The Celia case of 1855 in Missouri stands as a particularly chilling example, where a young enslaved woman was publicly hanged after defending herself against her enslaver's cruelty. At the Evergreen Plantation in Louisiana, owner Pierre Becknell maintained a designated correction ground where executions were conducted with ceremonial precision. Charles Ball, in his slave narrative, described how these events would often be scheduled for Sunday mornings, forcing workers to witness the execution before attending mandatory church services. The infamous Natchez slave market in Mississippi even had a dedicated gallows visible from the auction block, a stark reminder of the consequences of resistance. Some plantation owners took particular pride in their cruelty. Records from the Butler Plantation in Georgia describe how owner Pierce Butler would use hunting dogs not just to track escaped people, but as instruments of execution, a practice he reportedly viewed as entertainment. Butler maintained a special breed of Cuban bloodhounds, which he trained specifically for human hunting. Former slave Moses Roper described these dogs in his narrative. The dogs are trained to catch a man, but not to kill him unless he struggles or tries to escape when caught. The Belmont Plantation in Mississippi maintained a pack of 50 Cuban bloodhounds, each worth approximately $150, about $5,000 today, making their dog yard more valuable than many of their human captives. Sarah Peters, interviewed in 1937, recalled, "Them dogs was devils with fur. Their howling was the voice of death itself." The psychological dimensions of plantation punishment were perhaps even more insidious than the physical tortures. Family separation was wielded as a weapon of control, with children often sold away from parents as punishment for minor infractions. Frederick Douglass wrote that the hearth is desolate, the children, though motherless, are not allowed to cry, the husband is not allowed to show any emotion when his wife is sold from him. At the Magnolia Plantation in South Carolina, overseer William Petway kept a behavior ledger where he documented using family separation as strategic punishment. One entry reads, "Sarah's youngest sold today after her second escape attempt. She'll think twice before trying again." The slave markets of New Orleans became notorious for these punitive sales, with the famous St. Louis Hotel auction block serving as the final stage of many family separations. The unpredictability of punishment served as its own form of torture. Harriet Jacobs, in her narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, described how the mere sound of approaching footsteps could trigger panic attacks among workers, never knowing if this would be the moment they'd face the overseer's wrath. At the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, surviving records show how overseer J.P. Benjamin would roll dice each morning to determine which workers would be punished, regardless of their behavior. Former slave Henry Box Brown described this psychological warfare in his memoirs. "The master's footsteps were like thunder in our ears, each step carrying the potential for life or death." The Riverside Plantation in Mississippi employed what they called the Sunrise Lottery, where workers' names were drawn at random for punishment, creating a perpetual state of dread that modern psychologists would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The punishments were often tied to productivity in perverse ways. Some plantations maintained detailed ledgers correlating punishment with cotton yields, creating a macabre accounting of human suffering. The Drake Plantation in Mississippi kept meticulous records showing how increased severity of punishment corresponded with higher cotton production. Their 1851 ledger, now preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, includes the chilling notation, "Increased whipping schedule results in 15% productivity gain. Recommend implementation across all fields." At the Belmont Plantation, overseer Thomas Dabney developed what he called the graduated corrections system, where each pound of cotton below quota resulted in specific punishments, meticulously recorded in what became known as the Book of Pain. The system of punishment extended beyond physical violence to include deliberate humiliation. Workers were often forced to wipe each other's blood off the whipping post, participate in the punishment of family members, or thank their tormentors after being beaten. At the notorious Angola Plantation, overseer James H. Thompson required beaten workers to recite a gratitude prayer he had composed. The Laurel Valley Plantation in Louisiana maintained a correction ritual, where punished workers had to kneel before the overseer's house each evening, regardless of their injuries. Olaudah Equiano, in his autobiography, described how the very degradation was carefully crafted to destroy not just the body, but the soul itself. Religious justification was often used to legitimize these punishments. Plantation owners would cite biblical passages to defend their actions, while simultaneously denying their victims access to religious comfort. Reverend Thornton Stringfellow's widely circulated 1856 sermon, "Slavery's Divine Sanction," was used across multiple plantations to justify extreme punishments. At the Oak Valley Plantation, owner Samuel Davis required punished workers to memorize specific Bible verses justifying their treatment. Frederick Douglass later wrote, "Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference." The Retreat Plantation in Georgia even maintained a special punishment chapel, where religious services were conducted immediately after whippings, forcing workers to praise God while their wounds were still fresh. This architecture of cruelty wasn't just about maintaining control, it was about creating a climate of perpetual terror that would make resistance seem impossible. Yet even in this darkness, the human spirit proved resilient. The story of Robert Smalls, who orchestrated a daring escape from Charleston Harbor despite knowing the brutal punishment that would await failure, exemplifies this resistance. Charles Deslandes, who led the 1811 German coast uprising despite knowing he would face execution by torture, demonstrated how the human spirit could transcend even the most sophisticated systems of terror. As Harriet Tubman declared, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." The physical instruments of torture used on plantations now rest in museums, but their psychological impact continues to reverberate through American society. As historian David Blight noted, the sophistication of plantation punishment systems wasn't just about controlling bodies, it was about breaking minds and spirits in ways that would echo through generations. Each survivor's story, each act of resistance, each moment of dignity maintained in the face of systematic dehumanization stands as testimony to the indomitable nature of human dignity. Fields of affliction, disease, death, and medical neglect in America's cotton empire. In the vast expanse of America's antebellum cotton plantations, death was not merely an occasional visitor, but a constant companion, stalking workers through a lethal combination of medical neglect, brutal working conditions, and rampant disease. The cotton fields, while generating unprecedented wealth for plantation owners, became killing fields for those forced to work them. As Moses Grandy wrote in his 1843 narrative, "The cotton field is where hope goes to die, where the strong become weak and the weak disappear altogether." The most immediate health threats came from the cotton plants themselves. Their sharp-edged bolls would slice workers' hands thousands of times daily, creating entry points for deadly infections. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, despite his racist views, documented in 1851 how these seemingly minor cuts would frequently develop into life-threatening septic conditions. At the notorious Dockery Plantation in Mississippi, overseer records show workers were expected to continue picking, even with severely infected hands, leading to what they clinically termed cotton blood poisoning. One survivor, Sarah Ashley, recounted in her WPA interview how her mother's death began with a simple cotton cut. It started green, then black, then she was gone in 3 days. The Frogmore Plantation in Louisiana kept detailed medical records showing that nearly 30% of all deaths were attributed to infections from cotton-related injuries. Dr. James Brewster, a traveling physician in 1848, noted in his journal, "The hands of these workers tell a story of 1,000 small deaths. Each cut a pathway to potential doom." The prevalence of infectious diseases created a perfect storm of suffering. Malaria, particularly in the lowland plantations of Georgia and South Carolina, claimed countless lives during the summer months. The Butler Plantation's medical ledger from 1839 recorded 32 malaria deaths in August alone, yet work quotas remained unchanged. At the Evergreen Plantation near New Orleans, overseer Thomas Hamilton wrote, "Lost 15 to the fever this week. Ordered remaining hands to work double shifts to maintain production." Yellow fever outbreaks were particularly devastating, with the 1853 epidemic in the Mississippi Delta revealing the brutal calculus of plantation healthcare. Infected workers were often quarantined not to heal, but to prevent the disease from reaching the plantation owners' families. The infamous Yellowjack Summer of 1855 on the Greenwood Plantation saw 78 deaths in a single month, prompting owner James Humphreys to write to his cotton broker, "The dead are easier to replace than the crop." Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, found fertile ground in the overcrowded slave quarters. Dr. Josiah Nott's medical records from Alabama plantations showed infection rates as high as 40% in some worker populations, exacerbated by malnutrition and exhaustion. At the Belle Grove Plantation in Louisiana, Dr. William Cross documented how tuberculosis spread through the quarters like wildfire through dry grass, killing 23 workers in the winter of 1851 alone. The disease spread rapidly through the damp, windowless cabins, where workers were forced to rest their broken bodies. Frederick Douglass noted how the sound of coughing would echo through the quarters at night, a chorus of suffering that never seemed to end. The Whitney Plantation's medical logs reveal a particularly cruel practice of forcing tuberculosis patients to sleep in isolated cough houses, ostensibly for quarantine, but effectively creating death chambers where the infected were left to die without care. The physical toll of constant labor created its own category of death. Field workers regularly collapsed from heat exhaustion, particularly during the brutal summer months when temperatures could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. At the Parlange Plantation in Louisiana, overseer James McCarthy's diary entry from July 1847 reads, "3 dropped today before noon, replaced them with fresh hands by sundown." The Magnolia Plantation's death records from the 1850s show numerous entries simply stating "expired in field," a clinical euphemism for what was essentially worked to death. Sarah Moore Grimke, the abolitionist, documented how at the Charleston Neck plantations, workers who collapsed were often left where they fell until the day's work was complete, their bodies serving as grim markers in the cotton rows. Women faced additional horrors, particularly during pregnancy and childbirth. On the Wessington Plantation in Tennessee, pregnant women were expected to maintain a quota of 200 pounds of cotton per day until delivery. Mary Reynolds, in her slave narrative, described witnessing a woman give birth between cotton rows. She caught her baby, bit off the cord, wrapped it in her skirt, and kept picking. At the Hermitage Plantation, owned by Andrew Jackson, records show that pregnant women were given no reduction in work until the actual moment of delivery, with one overseer noting proudly that a woman delivered and returned to her row within the hour. The infant mortality rate was staggering. At the Smithfield Plantation in Virginia, records show that nearly 60% of infants died before their first birthday. Harriet Jacobs wrote of the Oak Alley Plantation, "The cries of newborns and the wails of mourning mothers formed a constant duet of despair." Dysentery, dubbed the flowing sickness by workers, was particularly devastating among children. At the Boone Hall Plantation, an 1849 outbreak killed 27 children in less than 2 weeks. The combination of contaminated water, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition created perfect conditions for the disease to spread. Dr. Toby Green, a plantation physician in Georgia, wrote in his 1850 medical journal, "The children waste away before our eyes, their bodies unable to retain even water." The few surviving medical records from the period suggest mortality rates from dysentery alone reached 25% in some plantation populations. At the Destrehan Plantation, overseer Philippe Leblanc maintained a death book that showed almost half of all child deaths were attributed to flux, dysentery, and related intestinal diseases. The absence of proper medical care turned treatable conditions into death sentences. At the Nottoway Plantation, the only medical treatment available was often administered by other enslaved people who maintained secret knowledge of herbal remedies, passed down through generations. When medical attention was provided, it was often experimental and brutal. At the infamous Oak Alley Plantation, the plantation doctor's logbook details horrific treatments, including bloodletting for fever and the application of hot tar to open wounds. The Barclay Plantation's medical records from 1848 describe forcing sick workers to drink turpentine and mercury as cures. Dr. James Marion Sims, now controversially known as the father of modern gynecology, developed his techniques through brutal experimentation on enslaved women without anesthesia at his makeshift hospital in Montgomery, Alabama. One of his victims, Anaka, endured 30 surgeries without pain relief, as Sims believed that African women don't feel pain like white women do. The psychological impact of witnessing constant death and suffering created its own health crisis. At the Laurel Valley Plantation, overseer Thomas Davidson documented what he called ghost sickness, where workers became catatonic after witnessing particularly brutal deaths. Contemporary accounts describe a condition called fixed melancholy among workers, what modern psychiatrists would likely diagnose as severe depression and PTSD. Solomon Northup observed how the sound of death became as common as the singing of birds. At the Evergreen Plantation, a woman named Lucy Thurston kept a secret tally of deaths carved into her cabin wall, discovered during recent archaeological excavations. This constant exposure to mortality created what historian Dana Ramey Berry terms a culture of survival, where death became normalized as part of daily existence. As one survivor told the WPA interviewer, "We learned to mourn without tears, for tears brought the lash." Even basic hygiene was denied, turning minor ailments into fatal conditions. The Drake Plantation's 1845 inventory lists 1 bar of soap per 20 workers per month, barely enough to wash hands, let alone maintain proper hygiene. At the Melrose Plantation, workers were forced to share a single water bucket for drinking and washing, leading to frequent cholera outbreaks. This lack of basic sanitation led to frequent skin infections, particularly in the humid southern climate. The condition known as cotton pneumonia, caused by inhaling cotton fiber dust, was so common it was considered an inevitable part of plantation life. Dr. William Holcomb's medical journal from the Richmond slave hospitals documented how cotton dust would coat the lungs like plaster, leading to slow suffocation. The treatment of injured or sick workers revealed the cruel economics of the plantation system. The Whitehall Plantation's ledger contains a chilling cost-benefit analysis comparing the expense of basic medical care against the cost of simply replacing dead workers. At the Humus House Plantation, owner John Burnside famously declared, "It's cheaper to buy than to heal." The Angola Plantation's accounting books from 1853 show a dedicated replacement fund for workers expected to die from disease or exhaustion. This calculus of human suffering reduced lives to mere entries in a plantation's balance sheet. As one overseer's letter to his employer stated, "Dead slaves don't pick cotton, but neither do sick ones, and the sick still needed to eat." The cotton fields of the American South thus became not just sites of labor exploitation, but zones of medical catastrophe where human bodies were literally worked to destruction. At the Waverly Plantation in Mississippi, recently discovered letters between the owner and his physician revealed discussions about the optimal point of physical breakdown, calculating exactly how long a worker could survive under maximum labor conditions. As former slave Charles Ball wrote, "Death was often seen as a mercy, a release from a life of unending torment." The Flowers Plantation in North Carolina kept what they called a survival calendar, marking the average life expectancy of field workers at just 7 years from their first day of work. Yet even in these killing fields, the human spirit showed remarkable resilience. Traditional healing practices were preserved and passed down in secret, creating a parallel system of care that helped many survive against impossible odds. At the Magnolia Plantation, an enslaved healer known as Old Sarah maintained a hidden garden of medicinal plants, her knowledge later documented by the Works Progress Administration Federal Writers Project. These survival strategies often involved incredible ingenuity. On the Hampton Plantation, workers developed a system of using specific work songs to identify which plants in the fields had healing properties. The Butler Island Plantation's surviving records include mysterious markings on slave cabin walls that researchers now believe were coded instructions for treating common ailments. As one former slave told her interviewer, "We had doctors among us, real healers who knew the earth's secrets. The white folks' medicine killed, but our remedies, kept in secret, kept us alive. The hellish hunt, how runaway slaves were tracked, tortured, and killed. The dense fog rolling across the cotton fields of antebellum America often concealed more than just the landscape. It hid the desperate footprints of those who dared to dream of freedom. In the murky swamps of Georgia's Okefenokee, the dense bayous of Louisiana, and the treacherous marshlands of the Carolinas, these escape attempts wrote a bloody chapter in American history. As Frederick Douglass wrote in 1845, "I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking." The mechanics of escape were designed to be nearly impossible. Professional slave catchers like Patty Cannon's gang, operating out of the Delaware-Maryland border region, worked in coordination with local sheriffs and plantation owners to create an almost inescapable web of surveillance. Their notorious Cannon's Crosses, strategic checkpoints where major escape routes intersected, became deadly bottlenecks for fugitives. In Mississippi, the Duncan brothers' hunting party boasted they could smell a runaway like hounds smell game, maintaining a gruesome collection of captured fugitives' belongings as trophies. At the infamous Millwood Plantation in Georgia, Overseer Thomas Thistlewood kept detailed records of his tracking methods, including the use of specialized Cuban bloodhounds bred specifically for human hunting. These dogs, as described by escaped slave William Wells Brown, could follow the scent of a human being with more accuracy than they could that of a fox or a deer. The geography itself conspired against freedom seekers. The Magnolia Plantation's Dead Man's Mile, a carefully maintained, clear-cut strip of land around the property's perimeter, gave patrol riders clear sightlines to spot escapees. At the Butler Island Plantation, Overseer Roswell King Jr. created what he called natural prisons by deliberately flooding lowland areas to form impassable swamps. Moses Grandy's narrative describes how escapees would stuff their pockets with red pepper to throw off the hounds, only to have the pepper itself become a torture when mixed with swamp water and open wounds. The Singleton Plantation in South Carolina maintained what they called constraint corridors, carefully designed landscapes that naturally channeled runaways into predetermined ambush points. The consequences of capture were meticulously designed to instill generational trauma. At Butler Plantation, captured escapee William suffered what Overseer Thomas Thistlewood described in his diary as exemplary punishment. 3 days of methodical torture, including salt-rubbed lashes, followed by being placed in a metal cage suspended from a tree for a week. Sarah, a young woman caught trying to escape from the Waverly Plantation in Mississippi, had both her feet deliberately broken and improperly set, creating what the overseer's records called a permanent reminder of the price of flight. The infamous Gorey family of Texas specialized in tracking escaped slaves and developed what they called signature punishments, distinct torture methods that would leave visible scars identifying which plantation a person had tried to escape from. The Whitehall Plantation's Book of Corrections, discovered in a Charleston archive in 1972, contains chilling entries like April 15, 1848, subject James attempted flight. Treatment, traditional hamstringing plus new method of ear removal to mark second attempt. Result, satisfactory demonstration effect on other property. At the notorious Bowman Plantation in Louisiana, captured runaways were forced to wear iron masks with inward-pointing spikes, a practice documented by French traveller C.C. Robin in 1803, who wrote, "The ingenuity of cruelty here surpasses the imagination." Organised resistance faced even more severe retribution. The Denmark Vesey planned uprising of 1822 in Charleston resulted in 35 executions and new laws specifically designed to prevent group assemblies. Solomon Northup described how overseers at the Edwin Epps plantation would randomly accuse workers of plotting rebellion just to maintain an atmosphere of terror. The Natchez Rebellion of 1729 led to such brutal reprisals that, as historian Herbert Aptheker noted, the Mississippi River ran red with blood for 3 days. The psychological warfare employed was sophisticated and far-reaching. At the Rivers Bridge Plantation in South Carolina, owner James Hammond developed what he called a graduated privilege system that rewarded informants with better food, clothing, and living quarters, effectively creating a hierarchical surveillance system. The practice became so common that Charles Ball wrote in his narrative, "Trust died among us like leaves in autumn. Each morning you wondered which friend had become an overseer's ear." The Oak Alley Plantation maintained what they called comfort houses, slightly better living quarters given to trusted informants, creating visible symbols of cooperation's rewards and resistance's futility. Even successful escapes often proved Pyrrhic victories. Take the case of Anthony Burns, who escaped to Boston in 1854 only to be captured under the Fugitive Slave Act. His return to Virginia cost the federal government $40,000, over $13 million today, and required 2,000 troops to suppress Boston's abolitionists. Harriet Tubman, discussing the period, said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more, if only they knew they were slaves." The Crafts' escape, William and Ellen Craft's stunning flight to freedom, where Ellen disguised herself as a white male planter and William posed as her slave, highlighted both the possibility and precarity of escape. Their narrative, running 1,000 miles for freedom, describes how even in free states, they lived in constant fear of capture. The statistics of survival were grim, documented in plantation ledgers and abolitionist records with cold precision. The River Vale Plantation's Runaway Register from 1855 reveals that beyond the 27 documented escape attempts, there were 12 suspected escapes where bodies were never found, listed simply as lost property, presumed deceased. The Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society maintained what they called the Dark Ledger, recording failed escape attempts that never made it to their network. William Still, the Society's secretary, wrote in his journal, "For every Moses we help across the Jordan, 3 sink beneath its waters." At the Angola Plantation, which earned its nickname the Bloodlands long before becoming a state penitentiary, overseer Samuel James pioneered what he called circular pursuit, a system where mounted patrols rode in expanding circles from the point of escape, coordinating through a network of signal fires. The iron masks he designed, described in an 1848 inventory as behavioral modification devices, became so notorious that other plantations ordered copies. One survivor, interviewed by the WPA in 1937, recalled, "Them masks wasn't just iron, they was pure evil made solid. You could hear them people trying to scream through the metal, sound like dying birds." The Gullah Geechee communities along the coast developed sophisticated resistance strategies that blended African spiritual practices with practical survival techniques. At the Penn Center on St. Helena Island, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of hidden meeting places where escape routes were planned using coded quilts and songs. Wade in the Water, a seemingly innocent spiritual, actually contained precise instructions for throwing off tracking dogs. As historian Joseph Opala noted, every song was a map, every prayer a plan. The economic machinery behind this system of terror was detailed with disturbing precision. The Belmont Plantation's 1851 ledger includes a section titled Security Investment Returns, calculating the cost-effectiveness of various anti-escape measures. A particularly chilling entry reads, "Purchase of new hunting dogs, Cuban breed, 900. Prevention of estimated 6 escape attempts per annum. Value retained 4,800. Return on investment 533%. Owner Thomas Belmont's correspondence with other planters reveals a network sharing best practices in escape prevention, including detailed descriptions of torture methods found to be most cost-effective. The transformative impact of this system extended far beyond emancipation. The techniques developed by slave catchers directly influenced modern law enforcement, particularly in the South. The infamous Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola still stands on the grounds of the former plantation, a physical reminder of how systems of control evolved rather than disappeared. The use of bloodhounds in law enforcement persisted well into the 20th century. The last documented case was in 1969, when Georgia State Prison used them to track escaped inmates. Some plantations became legendary for their brutality. The Dockery Plantation in Mississippi maintained what they called example yards, designated areas where captured runaways were publicly tortured. Their methods were so notorious that surrounding plantations would bring their workers to witness punishments. As one WPA interview subject recalled, even the trees at Dockery seemed to weep blood. The Randolph Plantation in Virginia developed a reputation for psychological torture, forcing captured runaways to serve as overseers' personal servants, making them complicit in the very system they had tried to escape. As historian Vincent Harding wrote, "The river of struggle in black history has never been calm. Each escape attempt, whether successful or tragic, added to a current of resistance that eventually helped erode the foundations of slavery itself." Yet the brutal mechanisms developed to prevent escape left scars on American society that remain visible today, reminding us that freedom's price was paid not just in sweat and blood, but in generations of trauma and transformed social institutions. And that is why you wouldn't last a day on a cotton plantation. The relentless sun, the raw hands torn by cotton thorns, the weight of a 100-pound sack digging into your shoulders, all under the unyielding gaze of an overseer's whip. It was not just labor. It was a system built on suffering. Solomon Northup knew this all too well. Enslaved for 12 years, he wrote, "There may be humane masters, as there certainly are inhuman ones, but there is no slave who would not rather be free." Because in the end, no kindness could make chains bearable. History does not forget, and neither should we. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.